Welcome back to the deep dive. We love digging into good topics, and today we're going to be exploring some fascinating vocabulary that you might have encountered on your, your English learning journey. We're not just going to define these words and phrases, though. We're going to unearth their origins, cultural connections, and maybe even some surprising psychological insights.
What's so fascinating about language is that it's a reflection of how we perceive and interact with the world.
Yeah.
These words we're diving into today are like little windows into different aspects of the human experience, from our deep-seated desires to our methods of learning and understanding.
I love that analogy. So, okay, the first word on our list is wanderlust. Now, you've probably heard this word before, maybe even felt it yourself, but have you ever stopped to think about where it comes from and why it holds such a powerful allure?
Wanderlust has its roots in German. It combines wandern, meaning to hike or wander, with lust, which signifies desire or pleasure. It's interesting that the word lust is embedded in there because it suggests something more profound than a simple wish to travel. It speaks to a deep yearning for exploration, a pull towards the unknown.
Yeah, the word lust does seem a little out of place, doesn't it? How did that become part of the definition of wanderlust?
It's likely a reflection of the Romantic era, which emphasized the power of emotions and the pursuit of individual fulfillment. Think of those romantic paintings depicting solitary figures gazing out at vast landscapes. That sense of longing for something beyond the everyday is at the heart of wanderlust.
Makes so much sense. Our source material gives us this example. After seeing breathtaking photos of the Alps, Julia's wanderlust was ignited. It's almost as if Julia's been bitten by the travel bug, right?
Exactly. And speaking of travel bug, that's actually one of the synonyms listed in our source material. Others include travel fever, itch to travel, and restlessness for adventure. Each of these synonyms captures a slightly different nuance of wanderlust.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you think the intensity of wanderlust has changed in our modern hyper-connected world? On one hand, we're bombarded with images of exotic destinations, but on the other hand, maybe that makes the world feel a little less mysterious.
That's a great question, and it speaks to how language evolves alongside our experiences. Maybe wanderlust today is less about escaping to uncharted territories and more about seeking authentic experiences, connecting with different cultures, or simply finding a sense of awe and wonder in a world that can often feel predictable.
That's a really interesting perspective. So for our listeners out there, maybe take a moment to consider what wanderlust means to you. Is it a yearning for far-flung adventures, or is it something you can cultivate closer to home?
And maybe even think about how your definition of wanderlust has evolved over time. Have the things that spark that desire in you changed as you've experienced more of the world?
All right, let's shift gears now and talk about a phrase that's probably familiar to anyone who's ever been a student. Hit the books. Now, I know you're not advocating for physical violence against textbooks.
Definitely not. Though I admit the mental image is quite amusing.
Right. Makes you wonder where this expression came from. Did students in the past actually whack their books to absorb knowledge through osmosis? I mean, I've tried some unconventional study methods, but that one seems a bit extreme.
I doubt it. Though it's fascinating to consider the possible origins. Our source material defines hit the books as simply studying diligently. But I think there's more to it than that. Let's imagine a student in the 19th century, hunched over their books by candlelight. Do you think the physicality of studying back then might have influenced the phrase hit the books? Maybe it was less about violence and more about the intense focus and effort required to learn?
That's a really interesting point. It makes you appreciate how much our learning environments have changed. I mean, I can't imagine studying by candlelight. I need at least 3 different lighting sources and a perfectly curated playlist to get in the zone.
And that speaks to how language reflects cultural shifts, too. What hitting the books means to a student today might be very different from what it meant a century ago.
Yeah, our source material provides the example. With exams looming, Chris knew it was time to hit the books and prepare thoroughly. Poor Chris. Sounds like he's got a lot of work ahead of him.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Though Chris is definitely not alone in that experience. We've all been there, that feeling of impending deadlines and the need to buckle down and focus.
Absolutely. And the source material gives us some great synonyms for hit the books, cram, study hard, and burn the midnight oil. Each of these words paints a slightly different picture of the study experience.
I'd say cram has a certain sense of urgency and maybe even a bit of desperation, while burn the midnight oil suggests a more dedicated all-nighter kind of study session.
Exactly. And then there's study hard, which is just straightforward and to the point.
But even in its simplicity, it conveys a sense of discipline and effort.
So for our listeners who might be facing a mountain of homework or an upcoming test, remember to hit the books metaphorically, of course. Now let's transition to a word that invites us to embrace a more contemplative state of mind. Pensive. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself gazing out a rain-streaked window, lost in thought. That feeling, my friends, is the essence of pensiveness.
That's a beautifully evocative word, isn't it? Pensive captures that state of deep contemplation, often tinged with a hint of sadness or wistfulness.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned sadness because I don't always associate pensiveness with negative emotions. I think it can also be a state of quiet reflection, a time for processing thoughts and emotions without judgment.
I completely agree. Pensiveness isn't necessarily about feeling sad. It's more about being absorbed in your thoughts, whatever those thoughts might be. And as our source material points out, it often involves a degree of introspection, a turning inward to examine one's feelings and experiences.
So speaking of introspection, our source material gives us this example. Staring at the sunset, Maria became pensive, wondering about the future. It's such a relatable image, that moment of quiet contemplation as the day comes to a close.
It's a classic depiction of pensiveness, and it highlights how certain settings or experiences can trigger that contemplative state. A beautiful sunset, a walk in nature, listening to a piece of music, these can all evoke a sense of pensiveness.
It's almost like those moments provide a pause from the busyness of life, allowing us to connect with a deeper part of ourselves.
Exactly. And that connection to our inner world is where the real power of pensiveness lies. It's through introspection that we gain self-awareness, process our emotions, and ultimately grow as individuals.
I'm curious, do you think our modern culture values pensiveness? We're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation. It almost feels like there's no time for quiet reflection.
That's a really insightful observation. It's true that our fast-paced, technology-driven world often discourages introspection, but perhaps that makes it even more important to carve out those moments of pensiveness, to resist the urge to constantly be on and allow ourselves the space to simply be.
That's such a good point. Maybe pensiveness is a form of resistance in a way of reclaiming our attention and choosing to focus inward rather than on the external noise.
I love that perspective. And it speaks to the potential benefits of pensiveness.
Mm.
It's not just about daydreaming or indulging in melancholy. It's about cultivating self-awareness,
Mhm.
fostering creativity, and connecting with a deeper sense of purpose.
And remember, our source material provides some helpful synonyms for pensive, thoughtful, reflective, and contemplative. Each of these words captures a slightly different nuance, but they all share that core element of deep thought.
It's fascinating how language provides us with so many ways to describe the same concept. It's almost like we need a whole spectrum of words to capture the richness of human experience.
Speaking of richness, let's move on to a phrase that's often associated with making decisions: gut feeling. Have you ever had that experience where you just knew something was right or wrong, even if you couldn't explain why?
Absolutely. We all have those moments where our intuition speaks to us, guiding us in ways that logic can't always explain. That's what gut feeling refers to, that intuitive sense, that instinct that arises without conscious reasoning.
It's interesting that we use the word gut here. Is it because those feelings seem to originate in our stomach, like butterflies when we're nervous, or not when we're worried?
It's a great question, and while the exact connection between our gut and our intuition is still being explored, there's definitely a sense that these feelings come from a deep, visceral place. It's like our body is sending us signals that our conscious mind hasn't quite processed yet.
Our source material gives us this example. Despite the job offer seeming perfect on paper, Sam had a gut feeling that it wasn't right for him. It's like something in Sam's subconscious was picking up on signals that his logical mind hadn't caught yet.
Exactly. And that's what makes gut feelings so intriguing. They often seem to bypass our rational mind and emerge from a more primal, intuitive place.
But how do we know when to trust our gut feelings? I mean, they're not always right, are they?
That's the tricky part.
Hmm.
Gut feelings can be incredibly insightful, but they can also be misleading. Sometimes they're based on past experiences or subconscious biases that may not be relevant to the current situation. Other times, it can be a genuine reflection of our deeper wisdom and intuition.
So it seems like the key is to find a balance between listening to our gut and using our critical thinking skills. It's about recognizing that gut feelings are a valuable piece of information, but not the whole story.
I couldn't agree more. It's about integrating our intuition with our logic, using both our head and our heart to make decisions.
And remember, our source material offers some helpful synonyms for gut feeling, intuition, instinct, and hunch. Do you think these words are interchangeable, or do they carry slightly different meanings?
While they all relate to that sense of inner knowing, there are subtle differences. Intuition often suggests a more developed form of inner wisdom, while instinct usually refers to a more primal, immediate response.